Bom dia a todos. É uma satisfação muito grande estar recebendo os membros da Plataforma Intergovernamental de Biodiversidade e Serviços Ecossistêmicos, cujo foco desse grupo aqui é a questão da capacitação profissional e da capacitação institucional para responder às 4 funções da plataforma. E é uma honra maior ainda contarmos com a presença do professor Ivar para fazer essa abertura. Professor.
Também queria saudar a todos, cumprimentar muito especialmente o professor Joly, que catalisa essa iniciativa como um desdobramento do Biota, que vem dirigindo há tanto tempo com tão bons resultados. Queria saudar também nosso companheiro de mesa, o Ivar Baste, que é membro do Bureau do IPBES e também co-chair desta Task Force de Capacity Building. Eu vou dizer 2 ou 3 coisas mais ou menos óbvias, mas com as quais eu me sinto muito à vontade, porque eu acho que é um ponto fundamental. É fundamental, é indispensável a relação entre ciência e o processo decisório. Não, o policy making, sobretudo na área ambiental, passa pelo imperativo do conhecimento. Na área de mudança climática, havia uma plataforma, e essa plataforma foi tão importante para se trabalhar a mudança climática, e era indispensável que houvesse uma plataforma que atendesse também a demanda de conhecimento para levar adiante a Convenção de Biodiversidade. Tendo participado como ministro da Rio 92 e também como ministro da Rio +10, eu sempre tive muito cuidado e muita atenção em relação a esses assuntos. E é por isso que eu tenho muito orgulho dos 3 grandes programas que a FAPESP apoia e sustenta, que é o Biota, o Bioem e o de Mudanças Climáticas Globais, porque é uma contribuição que a FAPESP oferece para o país e para o processo decisório do conhecimento indispensável para esta tomada de decisão. Quando foram trabalhados, ou quando se procurou estudar de que maneira a ciência poderia contribuir para Rio +20, nós fizemos, no âmbito das iniciativas da FAPESP, uma reunião com os policymakers do Itamaraty, para que eles tivessem a oportunidade de ter um insumo do conhecimento desses 3 grandes programas da FAPESP. Capacity building não é indispensável, porque sem esta capacity building, sem esta geração de capabilidade, não há a possibilidade de dar a essa plataforma a sustentabilidade necessária do conhecimento para que ela possa produzir efeito. Então, a reunião que nós estamos fazendo hoje aqui, que é a sequência de trabalhos desta semana anteriores, busca também dar uma divulgação mais ampla daquilo que está sendo feito e daquilo que pode vir a ser feito. Então, cumprimento a todos, cumprimento especialmente ao professor Joly, que vem sendo um extraordinário batalhador deste esforço. Eu tenho uma enorme admiração pelo programa Biota, eu repito sempre, mas ele gosta que eu repita e eu, portanto, continuo repetindo, que o programa Biota é um excelente exemplo da relação entre conhecimento básico e aplicação do conhecimento. O programa Biota ampliou o conhecimento, esse conhecimento teve um efeito do ponto de vista do processo decisório e, para citar uma frase do Pasteur que o professor Brito gosta de citar, não existe ciência aplicada, existe aplicação da ciência. E é isto que o Biota faz com grande mérito e com grande resultado. Obrigado.
Obrigado, professor Laffer. Eu acho que é um privilégio para a FAPESP e para os, mais especificamente para aqueles que trabalham na área ambiental, ter na presidência o chanceler que organizou a Eco 92 e depois organizou a participação brasileira na Rio+10 em Joanesburgo. Então, o professor Laffer conhece essas questões ambientais a fundo. Em 92 foi quando essas convenções foram assinadas, da biodiversidade, de mudanças climáticas e desertificação, e ele estava coordenando os trabalhos desse evento.
Obrigado, Carlos. Bom dia. Bem-vindos ao IPBES. And that is as far as my that is as far as my Portuguese goes, unfortunately. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here at PESP, and especially with your Professor Laffer. It's an honor to meet you. I know that you played such a very important role in the first Rio conference in 1992. And I think the legacy of that is really outstanding. It has put the world onto a discourse on sustainability. There have been several milestones in that discourse. And I think personally that the Rio conference in 2012 also went to show that this whole agenda is now moving towards a very balanced and integrated agenda with all different parts of the society being represented. And I think it's a very exciting development that almost as we speak, the governments and nations and stakeholders are discussing in New York how to develop a full-fledged set of sustainable development goals. And I think it's a very encouraging development indeed. And also very befitting in a world which is multipolar, which is polycentric, where there are so many different actors that are interplaying. And I think that whole approach of trying to agree on some common norms and use that as a basis for further dialogue and discussion is really very encouraging. And also, I think one of the key things is to align our efforts much better than what we are doing today. And that is very much what IPBES is about. It is about strengthening the science policy interface to shorten the delay in what science can bring to decision makers, shortening the sort of delay in the needs that policymakers have in terms of knowledge gaps. And the whole of IPBES is actually very much geared towards achieving long-term sustainable development and human well-being. It's an honor to be here. I'm representing the government part of IPBES, not really the science part. But I think that is also a very interesting feature of IPBES, that it has this intergovernmental dimension to it, which brings science and policy, governments and experts, practitioners and industry, as we have learned through the Sao Paulo dialogue that we had over the course of yesterday and the day before. So I think this has been a very rewarding journey to Brazil and to Sao Paulo. It is actually my first time in Brazil, but it has been very rewarding. And I'd like to thank you for hosting us and for being with us personally and inspiring us to keep on with our work and try to make sure that IPBES apply to the highest standards of both intergovernmental work and scientific credibility. Thank you.
Como vocês verão nas duas palestras subsequentes do Jerry Harrison e do Ivar, o IPBES tem essa estrutura na qual você tem um bureau que representa mais a parte política, são 10 membros, 2 membros de cada região geopolítica das Nações Unidas, mas tem também um painel de experts que é composto por 25 pesquisadores, então é a parte de ciência, com 5 representantes de cada uma das 5 regiões geopolíticas. E é um prazer que aqui, além dos membros da Força Tarefa em Capacity Building, a gente tem outros 2 membros do painel multidisciplinar, que é o Floyd Homer, de Trinidad e Tobago, e o Sepsep Demisep, que é da Etiópia. Então, nós somos parte desses 25 que estão desenvolvendo e trabalhando na implementação desse programa de trabalho. Então, eu gostaria de encerrar essa abertura aqui e deixar a palavra com o Jerry Harrison, do World Conservation Monitoring Center, baseado em Cambridge, e que aqui está representando o secretariado do IPBES. Então, Jerry.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Carlos has told you already, my name is Jerry Harrison, and I work for the United Nations Environment Programme's World Conservation Monitoring Centre based in Cambridge in England. And I have the unenviable task of giving you an introduction to the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I'm going to say IPBES every time after now, so when I say IPBES, it stands for the whole of that. So I'm going to give you a sort of primer. I'm doing so on behalf not only of myself, of course, but I'm doing so on behalf of the Secretariat of IPBES as well. So I'm going to give you something of a little bit of history and of the work program to give you a sort of primer on this intergovernmental process, what it's trying to do and where it's going. So one of the good questions is, well, where did IPBES actually start? And of course, anything like this sort of the start of a new intergovernmental process, the start of any new process, is often difficult to pin down where exactly it starts. But normally quoted is it started from a meeting that was organised in Paris on international biodiversity, science and governance. I can't remember which order the words came in, but it's that conference. And in his presentation, a keynote presentation to that conference, Jacques Chirac, who was then the president of France, basically said that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, had brought about a real change in attitude as a result of its work and the way it presented science, and that biodiversity needed some similar process to do that. I put what looks like a quote from Jacques Chirac on the board. Quite clearly Jacques Chirac said it in French, but it's essentially what the gentleman said. So it's a slight cheat, it's not a real quote, okay. No, so how does it, but the point is there's already an existing landscape out there of assessments already taking place. I've given you some examples up there. The GEO process led by UNEP, the Global Biodiversity Outlook led by the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So there's already a landscape of things happening there. Not only a landscape of assessments, but also a landscape of different organisations doing a lot of different activities, many of which are relevant to this, or directly relevant to this, all doing different sorts of things and different sorts of parts of this. So a big question at the start is, well, why do you need a new intergovernmental process? And that in part is why there was such a lot of discussion over quite a number of years on setting something up. So part of that process was a detailed gap analysis on, well, what is already there and what do we need to build on and complement what's already there. So yes, there's a big landscape there, so we really did spend a lot of time thinking of, do you need something new to add to that landscape? Now, there was a whole series of intergovernmental meetings. I'll give you a full list later on, but essentially, that shouldn't be 2012, should it? That should be 2010, I think. Excuse the date. That should be in 2010 in Busan, which is in South Korea on the south coast. Essentially, governments finally agreed that, yes, there was a need for a new body, a new intergovernmental body, that was responsive to the needs of governments, that would identify the scientific information needs of policymakers, that would deliver global, regional and thematic assessments, but not just deliver assessments at that level, but also promote and support assessments or promote support for assessments at lower levels, national assessments, or they may be state assessments, they may be actually across one or two countries, but also supporting them at different levels. But they would also promote the use of policy support tools and methodologies, and above all, they would identify and address capacity building needs right across that. So they identified there needed to be a new intergovernmental body, and these were the sorts of functions that it ought to undertake. They also agreed at the same meeting a number of operating principles, the ways in which this new process should work. It should collaborate with and build on existing initiatives. It shouldn't just sort of take over certain areas, duplicate. It's to build on what's already there. It needed to demonstrate a degree of scientific independence. It needed to use clear and credible processes. It needed to take an interdisciplinary and a multidisciplinary approach, indeed a cross-sectoral approach as well, to ensure further reach. Ensure full, effective and balanced participation, that's across the world, across regions, across different types of countries, gender, indigenous and local knowledge as much as scientific knowledge, building all of these things into the processes. And, emphasis again, it needed to build capacity building into all aspects of its work. So on to establishment, the IPBES was finally established, and in this case it was 2012, in Panama in April 2012, with the aim, and this is the stated aim, I think it's actually called an objective in the document that established it, but it's the objective, the aim of strengthening the science policy interface for biodiversity and ecosystem services for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, long-term human well-being and sustainable development. Whenever you get something defined by an intergovernmental process, it's going to have a lot of words in the title. It was agreed that the new structure would be based on a plenary. So this is the sort of how it works. The plenary is where the members of IPBES meet and take decisions. The members of IPBES are those governments who have said they want to be members of IPBES, essentially. There is a bureau which essentially oversees IPBES and its functions, what is happening. It oversees it in between meetings of the plenary and essentially carries the responsibility for implementation over that period. And there is a multidisciplinary expert panel, selected experts that oversee the scientific and technical functions. The Bureau comprises 10 people, 2 from each of the UN regions. The multidisciplinary expert panel comprises 25 individuals, again from across the regions. Also agreed in Panama were the rules of procedure necessary for the plenary to start and take decisions. The future location of the Secretariat. The Secretariat is now located in Bonn, Germany, but it was selected from, there were 5 offers to host in 5 different countries, but Bonn was finally selected. It was also agreed in Panama that UNEP would carry on as the interim secretariat until such time as the secretariat itself was established, but also ensuring and trying to encourage and promote cooperation between UNEP, UNESCO, FAO and UNDP, 4 of the primary UN bodies that have been involved in IPBES discussions, promoting their collaboration and their engagement with the new process. And finally, it agreed in Panama a whole set of work in order to prepare for IPBES to actually start. So to the first plenary. You might notice 2 of the guys in the bottom right-hand corner who were integrally involved in some of the discussions there. But in the top left is Professor Zachary, who was appointed as the first chairman of IPBES. So Bonn, Germany was where the first plenary meeting was held, a slightly cold and slippery and icy January in Bonn, Germany. And that took decisions on the membership of the Bureau. So there were a lot of nominations, and the membership of the Bureau, the 10 people, was finally decided, Ivar Baste here being one of those 10. They decided on the membership of the multidisciplinary expert panel, the experts with the science and other disciplines that would assist in the implementation. Carlos Joly, as you know, is one of the two co-chairs of the multidisciplinary expert panel. Floyd Homer over here is on that panel, as is Seb Sebi over here. So I've got representation from them here. So those three, incidentally, just as an aside, those three people will answer any difficult questions after when I finished, okay? They have responsibility, I don't. They also agreed in Bonn a process for making requests, inputs and suggestions, getting governments and other stakeholders to actually identify, yes, these are the urgent issues for us that we think should be built in to the original, or the first process. They put in place a process for development of a work program and a process for recruiting ensuring the process for recruiting the secretariat, and a budget. A bit difficult to do the rest without the budget. So later on, you might recognize one of the people there as well, actually. Later on, the second plenary took place in Antalya, Turkey. The main points of that plenary were to get in place decisions. There's a conceptual framework, the sort of framework within which IPBES operates. The work program for the platform. What will it actually do? So they agreed a work program until 2018. They agreed the procedures about the deliverables and how they should be done, because I mean it's a process. You've got to put these procedures in place so everybody understands what the process being followed is. They know what the process is, they can follow it. They put in place a budget for the platform for the whole period of that work program, and during the meeting identified the actual resources, the actual money for implementation for the first 2 years. So when it started, the money was already in place for the first 2 years. They agreed the financial and budgetary arrangements. Where would this money be held? It's held in the IPBES trust fund. So they agreed the processes and so on behind that. And they agreed a collaborative partnership with the 4 UN bodies I referred to before. So you can see from the beginnings of those discussions, so I said that the Jacques Chirac quote was in 2005 in Paris, to the end of last year where they actually had a work program agreed. You've got a series of, every one of those meetings down the side is an intergovernmental meeting. So it's actually quite a lengthy process to get from the idea, the thought, yes, this might be something we want, to something that's actually got a work program in place. It's quite a lengthy process. I'm not going to go down the list of meetings, but it's just to point out that it's taken a lot of thought, a lot of effort, a lot of people working on this to get to where we are now. So I'm going to move on to the work program and give you more on what it is that IPBES is actually doing. So just a bit of the sort of formal stuff on this. The work program was formally agreed by the plenary. So a document went to the meeting in Antalya last Turkey. I'll say that one again. It went to the meeting in Antalya in Turkey last December. And it was discussed at that meeting. Some modifications were made to it, but at the end of the meeting, the work program was agreed by the member governments. And if you want to know formally where it was agreed within that decision, and the work program itself is an annex to that decision. That's probably more information than you need. It was developed through a consultative process. It was put out as a request put out to governments and other stakeholders, what do you want in this work program? It was developed through the ideas that had come up in many meetings. There were drafts put together. The drafts were made available for open review. The contents were discussed in intergovernmental meetings and in the last plenary. So there's quite a lot of discussion in that process. And some of that discussion, input to that process, was not only from governments, but also from MEA secretariats on behalf of their parties, and from a range of different organisations and stakeholders. And as I said, sufficient funds identified to cover the first 2 years. So right back at the beginning, when I said IPBES had been established, there are essentially 4 key functions it undertakes, it aims to undertake. Promoting knowledge generation, assessments, policy support tools, and capacity building. Those are the 4 functions of IPBES. It's expanded on a little in the paragraphs beside it, but I mentioned, I went through that a little earlier. And all 4 of those functions are integrated across the work programme. So the work programme is structured around the objective of the platform, which was the text I gave you before. Then within that, there are 4 work programme objectives, which between them cover the 4 functions I mentioned. And then there are 16 interrelated deliverables, which between them comprise the platform's work. So the first objective is concerned with the foundations, the underpinning of improving the science policy interface, ensuring the knowledge is there, ensuring the capacity is there, ensuring the right processes for relating to different communities are there. The second objective relates to thematic and methodological assessment. The third objective to global and regional assessments and the ways in which the links between assessments are made. And the fourth objective addresses the communication, the ways in which the information coming out of the other parts of the work programme are used, are communicated, are embedded in people's activities. And just to stress again, all these are interrelated. They're not a set of separate objectives that are completely separate from each other or separate activities. All these are intended to be taken as a whole. So on the first objective, what I'm going to do is to run through the deliverables to give a picture of the sorts of activities that are being undertaken. So the first of the deliverables relates to identifying priority capacity building needs. What are the important things that need addressing with respect to developing and building capacity? And how do we ensure that these are matched with resources, whether those resources are financial or technical? The second deliverable relates to the ensuring that the specific capacities, or helping to ensure the specific capacities relating to implementation of the rest of the work programme are supported through building networks that help bring people who can help build capacity together, bringing people together, matching people with needs. The third deliverable relates to finding improved ways of integrating indigenous and local knowledge with knowledge derived from other methods, from science and so on, but also ensuring appropriate working methods, appropriate engagement across different communities, across different ways of thinking, across different cultures. And then the fourth deliverable relates to ensuring, well, IPBES will identify knowledge needs through a whole range of different parts of its process. How do we work to ensure those knowledge needs are addressed? How do we ensure that we can bring information, knowledge in from appropriate networks that already exist, and so on? So it's about building, encouraging engagement with the knowledge communities, with the science community, with the remote sensing and observation communities and so on. It's about bringing communities together to help ensure the knowledge and the information and the data are available where needed, whether it's now or in the future. So those are the sorts of deliverables under the first objective. Under the second objective, thinking about it, when I said it earlier, I said the two objectives the wrong way around because I wasn't looking at the screen. Under the second objectives, which deals with the global and regional assessments, you've got essentially the first deliverable there is the guide for producing and integrating assessments in the context of IPBES. So IPBES will do and support a lot of different assessments of different sorts of things, but you need some sort of continuity, some sort of ways to ensure that you can integrate across them so you can crosswalk between them. So one of the things being produced very early on is a guide. This is the way IPBES does it. This is the way we're thinking about integrating across scales. This is the way we're thinking about capacity building and what we need to know how to integrate it into your thinking. This is what we're thinking about scenarios and how to build them, what we're thinking about how to integrate issues on valuation. So it's basically putting together all the pieces on how do you do an assessment in the context of IPBES. The second deliverable here is about regional or sub-regional assessments. And the scoping meeting for this deliverable took place in Paris, I think, is it 3 weeks ago now? And several people in the room were at that scoping meeting in Paris for how do we go about doing regional assessments? What's important to get into all regional assessments and what is specific to different regions? What should those different regions be? So that sort of scoping was done in Paris, I think 3 weeks ago, and is being drafted now before going back to the plenary to say, this is what we think, is this the right way to do it? And then there will be a global assessment. The scoping for the global assessment will take place next year, and then that will begin, it is anticipated that will begin the following year. So the guidance, again, just to repeat, that's an important product for linking across these different assessments that I'm talking about here, and we'll talk about in the next slide as well. So the third objective is about thematic and methodological issues. So firstly, they agreed a fast-track assessment on pollinators, pollination and food production. And that assessment is already underway, and you'll hear about that from one of the two co-chairs of the expert group doing that a little later this morning. But they're also initiating other thematic assessments. Currently, I think it might be this week or last week in China, meeting in China, they're carrying out the scoping for assessment relating to land degradation and restoration. And next year they'll be thinking more about invasive alien species and sustainable use. All these being issues that came forward as being key in the process a year or two back when we were asking governments and others what they thought the key issues were to be addressed. But in addition to the thematic assessments, there are two methodological assessments. So these are looking at, well, what are the methods we should be using within the assessments? For example, in this case, on scenarios and modelling. Which are the ways we should be doing scenarios modelling, and how do we embed these into assessments? But they're also thinking about what policy support tools, what support tools are there for modelling, for scenario building, that could be promoted more for people to be using more widely in decision-making processes so they can start to develop or promote policy support tools in this area. So that assessment is also underway and will be delivering quite soon. There is a second one on the values of biodiversity and nature's benefits to people. How do we assess and understand what the values are so that we can better communicate them? What are the processes that should be used? Again, what tools can be developed on this? This is a rather more complicated issue, and indeed a rather more emotionally and politically charged issue. They're scoping this process at the moment with the idea there should be more in-depth work will be done next year. The fourth objective, more about the linking together of the information, the delivery of the information. The first is a catalogue of relevant assessments. The idea here is to build a catalogue of what assessments are underway, not only within IPBES, but elsewhere, so that there is a good catalogue of all the assessments taking place, whatever level they are, whether they're national, whether they're below national, subnational, whether they're regional. So there's basic information there on those assessments, the tools they're using, the way they're doing it. So in part, you can access, you can share knowledge on this, but also, of course, when you're planning new assessment, you can look at what's already out there, what it's been doing, and look at that as another method of drawing information in. There's the request to develop a plan, an information and data management plan. The key issue here being that IPBES is doing a lot of different work. It's going to produce a lot of different products. It's using information from multiple sources. Part of the credibility of a process like that is being able to track that information afterwards, to find it when you need it. And essentially this activity is building the plan for how to do that, and of course subsequent to that, of course, that plan will be implemented. So that you've got the underpinning structure to make sure all the information is findable, locatable. It says there, catalogue of policy support tools and methodologies. That's really sort of a code for rather more than that. They're starting to produce a guide on, well, what are policy support tools and methodologies? What policy support tools and methodologies are useful, what should be developed and promoted, how do you promote them, how do you put them, how do you tell governments, for example, these are a set of useful tools for you to use, or managers at any different level. So all these sorts of issues are being discussed within this group. The idea is it will produce a catalogue, and the point of the catalogue will be to improve the ability to access such policy support tools, the information on it, to access not only that, but access the community's practice, the experts that are building it, the people who are using it to get more experienced, so that that information can be shared more widely. There's also a lot of focus, or should be an increased focus, on communication, outreach and engagement, the ways in which you communicate what you're going to do, what you have done, the ways in which you engage multiple stakeholders are actually quite critical to the process and have been the subject of quite a lot of thought and debate. And the one other deliverable, 16th deliverable, which isn't actually on the slide, but it's in any process should be apparent, and that is the review of how well you're doing. So we need to put in processes to review how well IPBES is delivering, whether it's doing what we said it was going to do, whether it's actually having an impact, whether people are finding it useful, because all of that is important in the sort of the continuation of it. There's no point in continuing something if it's not actually useful. So the institutional arrangements, I already told you about the plenary and the bureau and the multidisciplinary expert panel. So, of course, the plenary is essentially decided on the work programme, agreed on the work programme, and of course has overall responsibility for everything. The Bureau has a degree of oversight to ensure it actually happens, because if not, the plenary is not going to be very happy with them. The multidisciplinary expert panel is responsible for the scientific technical oversight and advice. And between them, they're also responsible for ensuring that the right experts come to work on each of these deliverables and processes. And of course they're supported by the Secretariat based in Bonn, which has many of its staff are now in place. It's taken some time to get them in place, but many of them are now sitting there. The Secretariat is headed by a French lady by the name of Anne Larigauderie, and she's gradually getting her staff in place. But in addition, there are technical support units or other technical support for individual activities. So, for example, there is a task force on capacity building, and technical support has been offered by the government of Norway and is provided by the Norwegian Environment Agency. So there are many of the different products will have technical support through a technical support unit like this. Or indeed, in the case of the of the thematic assessment relating to pollination and pollinators. Technical support is provided by a consultant hired directly by the Secretariat. So a number of different methods are used, but there needs to be additional technical support other than the Secretariat. So each of those deliverables, you also need a range of different experts to help work with you to deliver them. So since May 2014, IPBES has established 3 task forces. So the task forces cover sort of essential overarching issues, and each task force is established for the whole period of the work programme. So there is a task force on capacity building, a task force on knowledge and data, and a task force on indigenous and local knowledge. And each of those task forces comprises 20 people selected from nominations made by governments and others, and then 5 Bureau and MEP members on each of those task forces. So many members, most of the people in the task force on capacity building are sitting in the room. You have 2 expert groups who are preparing guidance on carrying out specific activities. So you have an expert group preparing the guide for assessments, and you have an expert group working on the guide for policy support tools. On the guide for assessments, it is co-chaired by Ivar and Seb, both sitting in the meeting here. There are 2 experts carrying out assessments, one methodological on the scenarios and the other thematic on pollinators and pollination. And we have one of the 2 co-chairs of that group sitting here. These expert groups have rather more experts on them than the 20. I forget the actual number. Somebody might remind me, but I think it's something of the order of 80 people working on those assessments. And then there are 3 expert groups scoping future assessments. Before they're planned and implemented, they need to be scoped. You need to think carefully about, well, who is the target audience? How do you put together? What do they need? How do you put it together? What should the product look like for it? So the scoping has taken place. As I said earlier, the scoping here that referred to the 3 groups. One was looking at regional assessments and how that's gone about. One looking at the values and valuation approaches, and one looking at land degradation and restoration. So in summary, IPBES has agreed a work programme and sufficient budget is in place for the first 2 years. A number of countries and organisations have also offered in-kind support to aid implementation. And the meetings here in São Paulo are part of the in-kind support provided from the government of Brazil and from Biodiversity. Many activities are already underway, and experts from many countries are now involved. But it's still in its early phase. Many activities are still in the planning stage, and I think it's fair to say that it's one of these things where you have to constantly learn as you go on about how to go them. So I think it's fair to say, and I think the Bureau and MEP members here would agree with me, they're learning very rapidly on what works, what doesn't work, how to put these things together, and how not to do certain things. So with that, I will thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to answer questions. I'm not sure whether those are being done now or later, but I will pass all the difficult ones across to Ivar and to Carlos.
Paulo Garreta Arcote, eu sou oceanógrafo, eu atualmente respondo pela gestão da área de proteção ambiental marinha do litoral centro de São Paulo e atuo na área costeira desde 1985. A avaliação ecossistêmica do milênio, no nosso entender, ela trouxe uma contribuição para essa abordagem da questão ambiental que, no meu entender, como professor, também é um divisor de águas, né? Ou seja, relacionar serviços da natureza, dos ecossistemas, com constituintes básicos do bem-estar, acho que foi uma grande contribuição. A despeito da importância desse documento, eu não constato aqui, e eu não sei essa é a pergunta, eu gostaria de saber como é que ocorre em outros países, né? A capilarização dessas informações, né? nem mesmo nos ambientes universitários, né? Eu não vejo não vejo pesquisadores e professores que atuam na área ambiental fazendo uso dessas informações, né? Que, no meu entender, é um problema, é uma grande lacuna, né? Porque como que a gente vai poder relacionar, né, essa questão, a importância da conservação dos ecossistemas e dos serviços naturais, se a universidade não encampa, não endossa? O projeto Biota FAPESP é uma exceção, no meu entender, assim, né? Eu trabalhei em todos os estados litorâneos brasileiros. Então, minha pergunta é a seguinte: primeiro, os cenários, né, para 2050, definidos pela avaliação ecossistêmica do milênio, onde se constata um grande agravamento, uma grande pioria, né, dos serviços naturais oferecidos pelos ecossistemas, continua vigorando, né? Ou seja, aquele cenário que se dizia que daqueles 50 e poucos serviços, quase 20 já se encontravam muito afetados, muito alterados hoje, e que em 2050 o cenário era de uma grande pioria. Se esse cenário ainda continua vigorando, eu acredito que não conheço informações. E, segundo, como interiorizar essas questões, né, no âmbito da nossa economia, né, e do sistema político, que está focado no curto prazo e que não consegue, ou não, enfim, não enxerga o capital natural como principal, né, capital da nossa sociedade, pensando não só em termos de geração presente, mas também nas futuras, né? Então, sinto me alongar, mas assim, acho que esse assunto é muito interessante e eu gostaria de saber como que o IPBES pretende, aí, no caso do Brasil, adotar essa questão, até porque, no que diz respeito com zonas costeiras, nos tópicos definidos como prioritários, a gente não constata ali o problema, o foco na região costeira, que certamente é um dos biomas, por lei, né, na verdade fica difícil entender, mas um conjunto de ecossistemas que mais sofre degradação no caso do litoral brasileiro, né? Obrigado.
Primeiro, tudo que foi falado aqui envolve áreas marinhas, costeiras e oceânicas. Faz parte do mandato do IPBES. Então, o que nós falamos aqui não se restringe a ecossistemas terrestres ou de água doce. Envolve toda a parte marinha. Há um foco bastante grande. Não foi elencado como uma das prioridades para se fazer um diagnóstico, porque está em andamento um grande diagnóstico de áreas oceânicas e marinhas que deve ficar pronto no primeiro trimestre do ano que vem. Então, a gente achou que era melhor aguardar esse diagnóstico para, então, complementar, quer dizer, de que forma a gente pode interagir. Essa interação já começou entre o IPBES e as pessoas que estão coordenando esses inventários. Então, por isso que nós não há um diagnóstico temático focado em águas costeiras ou oceânicas. A internalização é uma das preocupações que o IPBES tem. Uma das formas discussões como essa, a nomeação, o envolvimento de mais pesquisadores com os grupos de trabalho do IPBES, e certamente, a partir do ano que vem, se de fato a gente conseguir que o plenário do IPBES aprove em janeiro os diagnósticos regionais e subregionais, isso vai envolver muita participação da comunidade científica. Nós vamos ter que envolver, nós não temos um diagnóstico nacional que nos permita entrar numa discussão de um subregional ou regional. Portanto, nós temos que resolver como é que nós vamos produzir, ao mesmo tempo, um diagnóstico nacional e estar participando dessas discussões que envolvem mais a região.
Just a couple of further points to pick up on parts of the question. One relating to communication and the other to government, or reaching to government. On the communication issue, I think part of the lesson learned from other assessment processes is the absolute importance of communication and outreach right throughout the process, and the need to clearly identify the audiences and who you're reaching out to. Sitting in the room is Solène, who was working on parts of this aspect when she was with the interim secretariat at UNEP. The point being that unless you communicate in advance what's going to come, people aren't ready for it. Unless you communicate effectively what you're doing, what you've done, people are not even going to know about it, let alone use it. Unless you communicate how to use what's coming, the information, it's again less likely to be used. So it's an integral part, and there is now a senior member of staff in place in the Secretariat whose primary responsibility is communication and outreach, and I think that's an essential part of it. And she is now working on the draft communication strategy that already exists and the draft stakeholder engagement strategy, and working with the Bureau on both of those, because there's an identified member of the Bureau responsible for leading thinking and work relating to the communication strategy, and there's identified people on the multidisciplinary expert panel who are looking very much at stakeholder engagement issues. So the discussion and the debate on that, on the communication issue, is certainly increasing. And relating to that point as well, that was also an issue that came up in the discussions we've had over the last 2 days, communication stakeholder engagement relating to engaging with other communities. During the discussions over the last 2 days, we've included people from the business community. We've also talked about the need of better reaching out to certain parts of the education community. So it is an area of discussion. I think it's an area that needs a lot more work, but I think it's moving there. I just wanted to make one point in addition to what Carlos has already said relating to governments. I think one of the concerns of a number of the previous assessment processes is that they haven't got integrated well enough into government thinking. And I think that was part of the reason why a new process was wanted and moved towards, because this is a process involving governments right from the start in helping to define what the assessments are, who they're for and how, and it will involve governments in bringing those assessments together and ensuring those assessments are being delivered in a way that is useful to government. So I'm really encouraged by the fact that there's a lot of government engagement with the process, because I think the engagement itself means that there will be more use of the outcome. Obviously you can't dictate how that will be, and it will vary from one country to another, but I think it's a positive direction.
Quando se propôs, quando está se trabalhando na questão dos diagnósticos subregionais e regionais, eles vão incluir a área costeira próxima, a área costeira continental. Portanto, áreas como a APA que você administra. A parte oceânica compõe um grupo à parte. Então, vai ter um grupo especificamente olhando para áreas oceânicas, principalmente as fora de jurisdições nacionais, que são um problema, mas também pode ser uma grande solução, se bem aproveitados.
Cristina Azevedo, da Secretaria do Meio Ambiente do Estado de São Paulo. Tenho 2 questões. A primeira, relacionada à força-tarefa de capacitação, se ela está focada exclusivamente à capacitação na área de conhecimento científico ou também na capacitação para gestão tanto no setor público quanto no setor privado. Porque a gente identifica hoje uma lacuna muito grande com relação ao conhecimento dos atores que trabalham com gestão, por exemplo, nas áreas protegidas. E a segunda questão é com relação à força-tarefa para conhecimento indígena e local. O objetivo dessa força-tarefa é estabelecer procedimentos para trabalhar com essas comunidades, ou seja, para ajudar a implementação do artigo 8J da Convenção? Obrigada.
On the first question relating to capacity building, if you permit me, I'll defer that until after Ivar has spoken, because he's speaking explicitly on the capacity building work and the work of that task force. Relating to the group on indigenous and local knowledge, I'm not specifically involved in that and haven't been involved in the discussions. I don't think any of the members here have either. I think they're looking at all parts of what you've just said. They're looking at what are the ways in which there should be collaboration directly with Indigenous and local knowledge. They're looking at mechanisms for bringing different communities together through dialogue. They're looking at learning from existing case studies, if you will. And in doing this, they're relating it to, for example, the technical support unit for that is within UNESCO, and it's the people within UNESCO who have got a lot of experience in working with Indigenous and local knowledge. Part of the aim of this is clearly to increase that engagement, but also to provide guidance that will help others to understand how to make the engagement and how to ensure it happens. Certainly my understanding is quite a bit of the feedback has been from Indigenous and local groups has been that this is quite a good approach being taken, and they're moving quite quickly, but it's early days, and if you're familiar with discussions on Article 8J, you will know that these have gone on for a long time, and of course it may well do the same in IPBES. Let's hope it gets to a better integration more quickly.
No desenvolvimento e na definição do marco conceitual do IPBES, mostrando justamente essa diferença em relação ao IPCC, de que aqui nós estamos trazendo o conhecimento tradicional como um sistema de conhecimento para complementar ao científico. O Conceptual Framework foi escrita em 3 línguas. Todos os itens, eles estão escritos na língua da ciência, são escritos na língua da negociação internacional e na linguagem indígena, na linguagem de que é a Mãe Terra quem nos dá todos, que não são serviços ecossistêmicos, mas que são benefícios. Então, é a outra visão. E isso está no marco conceitual. Foi complexo chegar nisso, foram 3 grandes reuniões ao longo de 2 anos, mas foi muito bem aceito pelo plenário, justamente porque cobre todas essas características, né? A gente, num artigo que estamos escrevendo, a gente compara isso com a pedra Roseta, que permitiu, né, como ela tinha a mesma frase em 3 línguas antigas, uma conhecida, as outras 2 desconhecidas, permitiu que a gente entendesse as outras 2, porque você tinha uma conhecida. Então, essa mesma concepção.
Maurício Taleb, sou Vice Chair Primate Specialist Group, Species Survival Commission. Falo em português. Tenho 2 perguntas. Primeiro, agradecer à FAPESP e ao Jerry por nos trazer essa informação tão importante. Primeira pergunta, eu gostaria de entender como que os grupos de especialistas já estabelecidos nas diferentes comissões da IUCN poderiam se envolver nessas task forces. E a segunda, talvez um pouco mais específica, quando o Jerry apresentou a questão do Data Information Management, eu gostaria de entender se a questão de avaliação através de indicadores quantitativos e principalmente qualitativos já estão sendo analisados e construídos, porque no entender que a quantificação de policies é algo bastante complexo. Então, a importância dos indicadores qualitativos nesse aspecto seria de interesse.
Okay, essentially 2 questions within that. The first relating to the experts themselves and how they're selected and how you can bring in other expertise, I think. And the second relating to the sort of data information indicators nexus. So on each of the groups I mentioned, the task forces and all the expert groups, the people on those groups were initially, there was a call for nominations that went out to governments and all stakeholders that have been involved in IPBES meetings to date, inviting nominations to each of the individual groups, and then selection was made based on using the nominations received, so selection for the task force of 20 people and so on. Clearly that's only a part of the expertise needed for any of these groups, and I don't know whether Vera, when she speaks, intends to sort of say how they're bringing in others, but the point is you've got a number of experts, say for example for an assessment, that you'll identify these as commissioning lead authors for different parts of it, but they will then need to call on other people to help them to write and draft parts of that, who will use information from multiple sources. On the task force, the task forces are relatively small in comparison, but they have the wherewithal, if they need to invite specific additional people to provide, as resource people for different meetings. So, for example, on this particular meeting of the task force on capacity building, the co-chairs have invited people from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity and of the Convention to Combat Desertification. They've invited people from the United Nations Development Programme, and so on. There are examples like that. Clearly, there are many people who have got potential interest in different parts of these, and it's a matter of being fairly selective, but also selecting people who can reach out to other networks and try and bring them in. But meanwhile, for example, the Task Force on Capacity Building is also looking at, well, how can we build this network even bigger so we can reach out, we can influence and bring together people in building capacity. And I'm assuming the other task forces are looking at things in the same way. So that's on the experts. On the information, data and indicators, it's an interesting question, because you may know my organisation is very much UNEP, World Conservation Monitoring Centre, is very much involved in indicators relating to the Biodiversity Convention, and we are the Secretariat for the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership. Now, if I can speak from that perspective for a moment, one of the things we want to ensure is that anything that IPBES does on indicators builds on what's already there and uses and tries to go in the same direction as the Biodiversity Convention is, using indicators relating to the HE biodiversity targets, because that needs to be done in assessing progress in achieving those targets in the period between now and 2018, 2020. So we're looking for alignment, and we're pushing for that alignment. Now, the responsibility for looking at this is actually with the Task Force on Data and Knowledge and Data, sorry, Task Force on Knowledge and Data. But they've had a number of other issues, so they haven't got to it yet, but we're going to be bringing it back to the table at the next meeting, and indeed, one of our staff who works with the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership went to that task force as a resource person, and we assume that sort of relationship will continue. So we're looking personally to make sure that's built in and make sure it's aligned with other processes.
Na reunião anterior que nós tivemos segunda e terça, nós chamamos de São Paulo Dialogue, a IUCN foi convidada e o Luiz Mérico veio como representando a IUCN. A IUCN será uma parceira estratégica do IPBES, exatamente porque tem uma larga rede espalhada pelo mundo de alta qualidade, gera e administra bancos de dados importantes sobre áreas protegidas, sobre espécies ameaçadas. Então, é uma das tarefas que nós vamos precisar fazer até a plenária de janeiro, é terminar a estratégia de engajamento de outros stakeholders, que estava ainda muito... não tinha amadurecido o suficiente na última reunião plenária, exatamente para a gente poder começar a formalizar essas parcerias. Por enquanto, elas têm sido uma colaboração informal, mas a gente gostaria de ter isso estruturado e formalizado, porque é uma rede de altíssima qualidade que produz informações e disponibiliza informações, assim como a gente deve usar parceria com o GBIF para as informações de ocorrência de espécies. Assim, são organizações que a gente quer trazer para perto de nós. Eu acho que a apresentação do Jerry deu uma boa ideia do quão ambicioso é esse primeiro programa de trabalho. para 5 anos, de 2014 a 2018, que foi aprovado pelo plenário, então está sendo implementado. E certamente muitos estão já diretamente envolvidos. Então, eu queria aproveitar a oportunidade para explicar como é que é o processo de você ser parte de um grupo de trabalho ou de uma força-tarefa. Então, o secretariado do IPBES manda para o ponto focal, quer dizer, cada país tem uma organização federal que é considerada o ponto focal, que é aquela que se comunica com o secretariado do IPBES. No caso do Brasil, isso é o Departamento de Meio Ambiente do Ministério de Relações Exteriores. Então, eles recebem essa demanda e o que eles têm feito eles repassam essa demanda, porque, obviamente, eles não têm o conhecimento técnico, eles têm um conhecimento diplomático, então essa demanda é repassada para o Ministério do Meio Ambiente, para o Ministério de Ciência e Tecnologia, que, então, fazem uma pesquisa, selecionam conjuntos de nomes para serem indicados para aquela tarefa. E aí entra no processo que o Jerry disse. Os nomes são, na primeira reunião que nós tivemos para selecionar experts, nós tínhamos mais de 1.200 currículos do mundo inteiro para selecionar. E essa seleção, ela leva em conta, obviamente, a parte técnica, o conhecimento que essa pessoa trará, mas ela também tem que levar em conta os critérios que as Nações Unidas usam. Então, você precisa ter um balanço regional, você não pode ter um número excessivo de participantes de uma única região. Então, as 5 regiões geopolíticas têm que estar representadas e, idealmente, deve ter um balanço entre homens e mulheres, que é o balanço de gênero. Nem sempre a gente consegue ter o balanço ideal, mas está dentro das regras de se tentar. Então, eu imagino que, em janeiro, o plenário vai aprovar o início dos diagnósticos subregionais e regionais. Nosso ponto focal vai receber a demanda para fazer a indicação de pessoas. Nós estamos tentando também repassar essa demanda para a sociedade, a SBPC, a Academia de Ciências, enfim, para divulgar no meio da comunidade. E, além dos governos, as organizações não governamentais que participam da plenária do IPBES também podem fazer nomeações. Então, a IUCN é uma delas, o WWF é outra, o ICSO, que é a Federação das Academias de Ciência, enfim, há um rol de instituições aí que podem fazer também as nomeações. Então, esse é mais ou menos o processo. Aqui no Brasil, o Brasil vai estar inserido numa região que nós denominamos Américas, para fugir da região tradicional das Nações Unidas, que, do ponto de vista biológico, não faz muito sentido. Por exemplo, América Latina e Caribe, ser uma região faz todo sentido, mas se você pega Europa Ocidental e outros, e nesses outros, Canadá, Estados Unidos, Austrália, Nova Zelândia, do ponto de vista biológico, isso não faz o menor sentido. Talvez na política de 1948 isso fizesse algum sentido. Então, nós redividimos, de maneira que nós criamos uma grande região chamada Américas, que tem 4 sub-regiões: a América do Norte, a Mesoamérica, o Caribe e a América do Sul. Então, o Brasil vai estar envolvido em fazer esse diagnóstico sub-regional da América do Sul. O problema maior que eu vejo é que nós não temos uma base nacional para fazer esse diagnóstico. Então, nós realmente vamos ter que organizar isso, pensar como que nós vamos estruturar isso para que a gente consiga, ao mesmo tempo, participar da elaboração desse regional, desenvolver um nosso nacional no nível de qualidade exigido para esses diagnósticos, né? Então, algumas pessoas perguntaram durante o café, então esse é o processo. Algumas das pessoas que estão aqui na sala, como eu já disse, o Antônio Saraiva, faz parte da força-tarefa de dados e conhecimento. A Cristiana Seixas participou do grupo que definiu essa nova divisão das regiões para elaboração dos diagnósticos e as métricas e o que tem de particular, né, cara, o que é uniforme que nós vamos precisar para todas as regiões e o que tem de particular em cada uma delas, que foi uma reunião, o Jerry mencionou, uma reunião que aconteceu em Paris há 2 semanas ou 3 semanas atrás, que também foi bastante intensa. Bom, sem mais demandas, eu gostaria de chamar o Ivar para fazer uma apresentação do que nós, enquanto força-tarefa de Capacity Building, estamos propondo para ser desenvolvido dentro desse período de 2014 a 2018. Ivar.
Now, we've heard about IPBES, how it's structured, how it's working, what it's supposed to deliver. And one of the areas that it is really expected to deliver is in the area of capacity building. That has been a very important feature of IPBES, and is also a feature where it distinguishes itself a bit from the IPCC and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and some of the other science policy interface instruments, although it's probably not quite true either, because they also pay attention to capacity building, but in the IPBES, capacity building has a very prominent place. So I'd like to talk a little bit, also try to put this capacity building a little bit more in context, not only in the work program of IPBES, but put IPBES a little bit more in context of sustainable development. It's very tempting to do that when one is in Brazil, which is sort of the place where sustainable development was coined politically through the Rio conference in 1992. So I'd like to look at sort of the role of IPBES as a sort of new institution that can help contribute to social tipping points towards sustainability. We know that the world is not sustainable as of today, but we're trying. We're trying to sort of make sure that that we're moving towards a more sustainable world, and we have to. And I'd like to sort of look at a few of the challenges we as international community, that humanity is facing. And I don't want to dwell too much on it, but it's tempting to sort of use Rio 92 as the sort of benchmark and say what has happened since then, and what are we in for in terms of challenges and changes. And I think what we all see and experience in sort of everyday life is a society which is sort of constantly sort of expanding activities, where the global flow of people, ideas, goods, services, technology, and capital is sort of ever increasing. And a few sort of facts and figures. So just since Rio, 25% increase in the population, up to 7 billion now. When I left school some 40 years ago, the world population was half of it. In 2050, we'll be 9 billion, as far as the predictions go. Same period, 75% growth in GDP, tripling of world trade, but also financial crisis, so it's a bumpy road, this. There's a growing problem of disparity in the world, with still 1.4 billion people in poverty. Also perhaps the realization among poor people that there are poorer because of much more access to information through the IT revolution, amongst others. If we look at climate, half of the world increase in average temperature has happened since '92. We have had a 9% rise in emissions. What we have to do towards 2050 is to reduce the emissions to between 50 and 80%. We have a loss of biodiversity. We'll talk more about that, and the degradation of ecosystem services. There's a lot of things happening in the sphere of technologies, not least the IT technology. There are some quite profound geopolitical changes that has taken place the last sort of 20 years or so, from a sort of bipolar world to a world that is really multipolar. A lot of new challenges on so many geopolitical dimensions. It's really, I think the Chinese say we are living in very interesting times. And I think when we are now facing sort of the challenges towards 2050 and beyond, we actually only have one sort of overarching recipe, and that is sustainable development. We have to sort of meet the needs of current generations without compromising the ability of future generations to do the same. So a small slide on that. What is actually sustainability? What are these needs? Well, we're actually talking about human well-being at the very center of sustainability. The Nobel laureate in economy, Amartya Sen, Professor Amartya Sen from India, he coined that, and he said that what we're really looking at is sort of the constituents of human well-being. It really sort of boils all down to sort of good health, basic material needs, good social relations, and security. And one can ad-lib on that. There are other dimensions to it probably within that, and that could be added. But that's really sort of the core of it. Then the sort of conventional thinking around this is that there is a number of factors then determining sustainable development, both in the social domain, in the economic domain, and in the environmental domain. And what IPBES is really looking at is the biodiversity and ecosystem services, which I've sort of tried to highlight a little bit here in red. And what is ecosystem services? I'm quite sure many of you are very familiar with it, but still, I looked at the survey in Norway, sort of asking how many knew what ecosystem services was, and I think it was actually only 5% who was familiar with the term, who knew what it really meant. And there's also these anecdotes about surveys that have been going on in the world, people asking what biodiversity is, and there's this anecdote saying that a lot of people thought it was a washing powder. But so we obviously have a communication challenge if that anecdote is correct. However, people have told me that they've been searching for this sort of survey and it doesn't exist. So it's an anecdote, which is a kind of good story, but might not quite be true. But I think the challenge we as a community have is still to convey what's ecosystem services. And Jerry pointed to the conceptual framework of IPBES. We haven't really gone into it, but that is really an attempt to convey this message, and as Carlos said, through sort of multiple languages. But if we were to sort of summarize it sort of very quickly, it is provisioning services in terms of food, medicine, fiber, energy, the ornamental values. We had in our dialogue on capacity building over the last 2 days, the company of Brazil, Natura, which is a global company, and it's basically working on cosmetic, also very much based on provisioning services from ecosystems. There's a whole range of regulating services on water and climate regulation, carbon sequestration, neutral cycling, and not least pollination, which I think is a very good way of exemplifying what ecosystem services are. And we'll hear more from Professor Vera about what is really happening. I think it's a very exciting work which is taking place under IPBES right now. There are a number of cultural services, recreation, tourism, and other related values, as well as sort of existence values, bequest values. But we should not forget that ecosystems are not only sort of providing positive support to humans and benefits to people. There are also stress and disbenefits, the obvious diseases, pests, toxins, carnivores. But even there, it's not only bleak. I have a son that works on venoms from spiders and snakes. And of course we know they're deadly, but they can also do a lot of good. They are really potentially very important in terms of as painkillers, as medication on autoimmune diseases. And that whole notion of using nature, also nature-based solutions in terms of coming up with new products and in terms of medicine, also goes to show that biodiversity and ecosystem services are actually linked with all the other key determining factors, and we can map them out. And I think part of our challenge is actually to demonstrate all these linkages. There's some very interesting work going on under the UN General Assembly right now as we speak on developing sustainable development goals, as we talked about earlier this morning, and mapping out those linkages, those interdependencies, has been an important part of that work, and this is also where IPBES can help contribute. So if we look at the state of biodiversity, I don't want to go into the details, but we know that we're losing a lot. This is some figures from the 5th Global Environmental Outlook. There will be an assessment coming up in 2018 that hopefully will give a much more comprehensive picture of what is happening with the biodiversity of the world and what that means in terms of impacts on everyday life of people on the planet. So let's turn a little bit to this whole notion of social tipping points, perhaps very quickly. This is a cartoon that was prepared and developed by a cartoonist of a newspaper in Africa. The Daily Nation is the biggest newspaper in Kenya. I used to live there for 10 years, and I kind of think it illustrates many things about sustainable development. One thing is that we, from the environment side, have been very much focusing on this wobbly pillar of the environment. But we've seen that the other pillars also certainly can shake. And when they shake, when the forces in society are changing, then it can also lead us to tipping points where there is sort of a point of no return. Society is changing. That can be bad, but it could also be for positive. So what we need to sort of look for is sort of how to, over time, stimulate positive development. And knowledge is really a key thing in that respect. When we think about knowledge in the context of IPBES, we have to remember that it is very much distributed around the world. The centers of which are taking decisions in a multipolar world is really sort of polycentric. This is a term that was coined by another Nobel laureate in economy, Professor Elinor Ostrom, she described it in a much more articulated way than I can, but she really looked at it as different sort of entities of decision making, when partly similar value systems, partly different, partly cooperating, partly sort of competing. And I think if we look at the world with the public sector, the private sector, which absolutely constitutes some 2/3 of the gross national product and of the economy of the world, we will see a very sort of complicated picture. So how do we as IPBES operate in that? What is our mission? What do we add? And why is capacity building important? Well, if we look at IPBES in sustainability, our key mission is really to sort of be strengthening the science policy interface. We had some questions earlier today about, there is a need also to develop the policy capacities. There's a need to develop the scientific capacities. Yes, there is a need to develop all those, but there are also separate institutions dealing with those. We have several conventions on biodiversity and ecosystem services. We have scientific programs like the Future Earth, for instance, the Belmont Forum. But the real mission of IPBES is to be that sort of facilitator in the science policy interface. So we are sort of in between. So what does that mean? We'll come back to it in a short while. So when we work in that science policy interface, we have to keep in mind a few other interfaces and other dimensions. And one is obviously this link between biodiversity ecosystem services and development and those sort of multiple sectors that involves. So we have to be able to present why biodiversity and ecosystems are important to society. And when we do that, we have to factor in the scale dimension. So we're a global institution, but still we have to try to make a difference at local level. So we need to address the sort of multiple scales, and IPBES is set up to do that. That is also poses opportunities, but challenges. And the last dimension is really the dimension of time. So when we're talking about knowledge, when we're talking about the impact on society, a society which is changing, ecosystems which are changing, we need to look back and see what has happened, try to explain why we are where we are, but we also need to look ahead and use methodologies to try to explore through scenarios and modeling what is likely to happen. What are we in for, and what can we do as a society to try to move towards sustainability. So it's a small piece, in a way. IPBES is a small piece of a much larger puzzle, but a very significant one, because it is but has the potential of advancing and moving the world and pushing the world towards sustainability, hopefully, if we do the right things. So I just want to say that this whole intergovernmental sustainability governance is a very complex one. It links with national rights and obligations, obviously. For it to be relevant, it needs to link to the national development priorities, to local development priorities. But the key thing that we're looking at now today and this week is really how do we grow the capacity in a world which is highly asymmetric and when it comes to capacities. So that's also an opportunity where IPBES can help make a difference. So what is IPBES value added? Well, I think actually Jerry explained it very well, and Carlos have also alluded to it by demonstrating sort of the nature of IPBES operations. And perhaps I'd just like to say that one of the sort of real strength of IPBES is that it works through others. It has a very small, lean secretariat. It's actually formally not even part of the UN. It's an independent legal body. It has its own rules of procedures, but it's very strongly attached to the UN administratively. So it's administered by the United Nations Environment Programme. But it's a highly independent body, and it has a very small and lean structure in terms of secretariat, but it works through in-kind contributions of experts, and it works through in-kind contributions from member states and institutions. And through that sort of networked structure, there is also a potential to reach a lot of big parts of the world, basically. So capacity building in IPBES, this is also something that Jerry alluded to, but it's basically in its functions to prioritize the capacity building needs and then provide and call for financial and other support for the priority needs that are directly related to the activities of IPBES. So again, it's sort of really homing in on the IPBES functions and the IPBES place in the wider sustainable development governance structure. And a few of the operating principles that are very important for capacity building is to ensure the full and effective participation of developing countries in the operations of IPBES, and that would not go automatically. It requires some measures. And it's also to integrate capacity building into all relevant aspects of its work. So the objectives is sort of set out here. There are sort of two key deliverables. Again, Jerry pointed to those, but these are the ones sort of governing our work in the task force on capacity building. And it's quite deliberately formulated, because one important thing with capacity building is that in order to make it attractive to invest in capacity building under IPBES, we have to be able to measure whether we are achieving what people are investing in. So we need to be able to report back to any donor or to anyone who'd like to be associated with IPBES in terms of advancing capacity building. And that is then the need then to to formulate the sort of deliverables so that the achievement is only made if the needs that we have identified have been met and matched. And the other part of this work program really is more about the nitty-gritty of how to do that. The task force that is established on capacity building is here, most of the members. It has a very sort of explicit terms of reference set out by the plenary. It operates for the life of the work program up to 2018. It has 25 members from 25 different countries. And it's supported by the technical support unit provided by the Norwegian Environment Agency, where I'm also working. And Nina Vik here is representing the interim unit, and it is, and I think also an interesting aspect of the way IPBES is working, that it is actually working through a lot of other institutions, like technical support units for the different task forces and for the different assessments. So what is the approach then that the task force is looking at? Well, as I mentioned, the first challenge that we have is to try to identify the priority capacity building needs as they are relevant to the IPBES activities set out in the work program. And we're doing that based on a certain set of criteria. So these then needs would sort of both be financed by or activities which are funded through the trust fund of IPBES, which is a fund set up by the plenary, and there are governments have pledged resources into that fund. But the other function of IPBES, which is also a bit special, is to have that catalyzing role to mobilize resources outside the trust fund and outside IPBES. And that could be both financial resources, but it could also be technical resources. When that said, we are now trying to identify sort of the kind of activities that we can undertake under IPBES in order to make sure that capacity building takes place. So we're working on a fellowship, exchange and training program, which will be presented to the plenary of IPBES in January for approval. But we're also looking at the different kind of piloting activities, and I'll come back to that a little bit. But since we are in the situation where it's not only the fund of IPBES that can go towards these activities, but also resources outside, we're looking at sort of how do we play this catalyzing role. So one element that is in the IPBES constitution is actually a capacity building forum. And we're looking at sort of how should that be set up? What kind of dialogue do we need in order for that to work? And the other thing which is mentioned in the IPBES work program is a matchmaking facility. So during the course of Monday and Tuesday, we had the Sao Paulo dialogue with experts from different parts of the world, from business, from different multilateral institutions, looking at sort of how do we construct a matchmaking facility in a way which really is targeted towards delivering the IPBES objectives in capacity building. One important last dimension of our approach to capacity building is to work through networks and platforms around the world, which are designed to strengthen the science policy interface, and also to be very wary about how we communicate the challenge. So we had some very nice communications experts with us earlier this week, gave us some very good insights into how not to do things. Apparently, a lot of the things we do in communications are very good examples of how not to communicate. So we have to sort of sharpen our focus and explain why we are important to others' missions or other business plans, to other institutions that do have resources that are operating in this field in a much more sort of deliberative and iterative way. Anyway, I shall try to not speak too long, but I'll just sort of flag very quickly a list of different capacity building needs that have been identified through quite elaborate processes. And I do not want to go into them in detail because I'm running, I think, a little bit out of time. I'm looking at Carlos here to get some indications of how much I can overstep the time limit given to me, given that we started a little bit late. But I think this just gives you a flavor of the different capacity building needs that are out there. So they relate to enhancing the capacity to participate effectively in IPBES assessment. It's how you use national and regional assessment and how you development. How you improve the capacity to access and generate data, information, and knowledge. Capacity to bring together science with local knowledge. Improve the capacity for transdisciplinary and trans-sectoral communication. Capacity for enhanced and meaningful multi-stakeholder engagement, how to enhance the human resource and skill base, and develop capacity to locate and mobilize financial technical resources. So some of them are sort of very specific, others run a little bit across. In terms of the fellowship and exchange program, this is something we have to table, as I mentioned, to the plenary. And we are also, as Jerry mentioned, developing a guide as to how to do assessments. There are also guides on how to do scenarios, on how to work on valuation. So there are a number of sort of supportive material that will come in the next months and next few years. We're also looking at pilot activities for 2014, how to be much more in the dialogue with the regions. How to support the pollination assessment that we will hear more about, how to support the assessment on scenarios and modeling. In terms of network and communication, that is quite a challenge actually, because the world is highly networked as it is. So how do we do that? Well, I think a few sort of key words. It has to be purpose-driven. We have to give these networks a purpose. We have to build on existing institutions. We have to engage with topical and functional centers. We use this sort of notion centers of excellence. We were told by a number of people earlier this week we should not use that. So that's why it's not appearing here now, and it used to appear on our slides. We have to use existing communities of practice. We have to basically try to enhance the connectivity in these existing networks and draw on them. So perhaps two final slides on the Sao Paulo dialogue, what that sort of led to. And I'll use the opportunity to bring this also a little bit to the attention of members of the task force that were not present in the meeting. But basically we try to look at this sort of matchmaking facility from different angles. So how do we match the capacity building needs with the resources under IPBES? And we learned quite a bit from both the Convention on Desertification and from the Convention on Biodiversity. They have some very good experience, but quite different sort of sets of experience. One very sort of open marketplace from the Convention on Desertification and the Convention on Biodiversity, a more managed matchmaking system for protected areas, which I think both of them gave us some very important input and feedback. We looked at sort of how to help ensure that capacity building is sustainable. That is one of the big sort of challenges in the international community. And the whole sort of fact that we need to be, there are so many issues there, so I don't want to go into all of them, but it has to do with developing sort of a mutual approach. We have to be adaptable. You have to think about both institutions and individuals. So both matters in a way, both in the institutions and the individuals matter. Now the question is also how we can more effectively build on what is there, and one thing is obviously to work through others, to learn from others. A fourth point is that we looked at is sort of how to make the connection, how to strengthen the connectivity that will build the capacity, and how do we do that when we are actually living in a polycentric world. And then we focus quite a lot on how to use communication and sensitization. And how we coin the messages, coining the messages, the way we go about developing them, the way we go about interacting with our partners is incredibly important. So we learned a lot, and then by the end of the day we're thinking, well, what does this all amount to? Because when you're in a dialogue, it sort of goes, you get inputs from so many different angles, and in the way you sort of feel that you're sort of in a state of sort of somewhat more in-depth understanding, but also, on the other hand, a little bit higher state of confusion. So we try to boil this down into some sort of key priorities for IPBES, and this is actually what we in the task force will need to consider now during the course of this afternoon and the 2 next days. But I'd just like sort of briefly to share it with you. And that first one is actually to focus on the need to ensure the ability of experts around the world to participate in IPBES activities, and that is really a focus on the fellowship, exchange and training program that can support the assessment on pollination and some of the other thematics assessment ongoing. But the really important part is, as Carlos pointed to just before I started, the potentially upcoming regional assessments. So that is a very important focus will be of our discussions during the next couple of days. And the potential of using regional dialogues to better understand what the needs are, to better also communicate what the opportunities are, is something we also will be looking at. We would also be looking at the capacity building forum and how to work with different partners out there, both donors and providers of data and more technical resources. Another thing which goes very closely with the regional assessments, and Carlos explained what these 5 regions were: the Americas, the Africa, the Asia Pacific, and the Europe and Central Asia, and the open ocean. We've been looking at the sub-regions in these assessments. But we all know that it's also a need to look at national and local capacities. And one way of doing that is to explore how to support the development of national biodiversity and ecosystem assessment. That's what's called BES assessments here. One thing that we learned from the LifeWeb initiative of CBD and the Convention on Biodiversity is that this has to be managed. So one can provide support both to the development of proposals, but also to the implementation of it based on expression of interests. So it's looking at the dynamics of this. We also identified some possible pilot areas, and they are directly related to other functions of IPBES. And they relate to the development and customization of policy support tools. That could be evaluation techniques, it could be scenarios and modeling. It's use of indigenous and local knowledge, it's access and generation to data, information and knowledge, and it's communication and outreach. There could also be others, and there are others in there. So these are some of the, in a way, outputs, kind of where we landed a little bit in the Sao Paulo dialogue. The fact that FAPESP hosted this was a very important contribution to the thinking that we are in the midst of, but it's an iterative process where we have not concluded yet. But our hope is to make sure that we facilitate the participation of experts around the world in the IPBES assessments, and that's actually where I'd like to end, and I think it will also tally very much with Carlos' point that please stay engaged with IPBES. There are a lot of opportunities for engagement as experts, as authors, as reviewers, through fellowships, exchange programs, training programs. To just mention a few, there are more opportunities. It's a highly networked operation, and it will only succeed if experts around the world take an interest in it. And I think the next presentation will very much go to show the power of this kind of networked approach. So with that, muito obrigado.
Ainda que talvez fuja um pouco do objetivo de construção, de formação de especialistas de capacidades, mas acho que relacionado, principalmente, quando você informa que na Noruega, né, apenas 5% dos entrevistados sabiam o significado dos serviços naturais, né, os serviços ecossistêmicos. Né. Nós tentamos, quando a gente verifica os relatórios da avaliação ecossistêmica do milênio, totalizam em torno de 3.800 páginas, né? Todos os relatórios. Em português, nós não temos 100 páginas, 98, enfim, 100 páginas mais ou menos, né? Em espanhol, a gente tem um número bastante grande de páginas. E nós tentamos desenvolver uma atividade, traduzir para o português, né, porque quando nós falamos na população lusófona, estamos falando de apenas 3,6% da população do mundo, em ordem de grandeza, né? Mas essa população está alocada em países mega diversos, né? E para o brasileiro em específico, mas também para os outros países, se já é difícil ler em português, eu não falo do ambiente universitário, né, torna-se quase impossível ler em outro idioma, o espanhol, que aparentemente para o inglês pode ser semelhante, né? Então, eu reforço a necessidade. E, bom, conversando com algumas pessoas da Avaliação Ecossistêmica do Milênio, o Dr. Walt Reis, enfim, outras pessoas, inclusive, que trabalharam na publicação desses documentos, foi considerado e falou assim, olha, não vale a pena se investir esforço na tradução para o português, porque esses documentos já são antigos, 2005, 2006, 2008. Né? Bom, por outro lado, esses documentos, no meu entender, são basilares, né? Eles são uma referência, né? Então, de novo, minha sugestão assim, ressalto a importância da gente direcionar um esforço para traduzir para o português, né, para que mais pessoas fora do universo acadêmico possam ter acessos a tão importantes informações como estímulo, né, para até mesmo direcionar suas carreiras ou promover o envolvimento, né, nessas atividades do IPBES.
Well, thank you very much. I think that is a very valid point. I mean, it is quite a challenge to communicate this, I think, in many different nations. Portuguese is a huge language compared with Norwegian, I'll tell you. And this survey, actually, it's interesting, took place just a few months after quite a big study was released on the importance of ecosystem services to society. So there was not a lack of material available, I think, but it is just something that probably would take more inclusive processes at the national level to sort of make sure that more attention is given to the whole concept of ecosystem services, to the importance of ecosystems to society. And one thing that we are contemplating in Norway now is to do a national ecosystem assessment, which are much broader, that involves much more experts in our country, that involves much more stakeholders, so that through the process you also sensitize people to the thinking that lays behind the concept of ecosystem services. And I think that is something which the whole concept of sustainable development, the fact that it has taken us almost 20 years to come at a stage where the international community is really looking at developing true sort of sustainable development goals, which brings in all aspects of society into one set of goals. It goes to show that these things are thought processes that we need to nurture, and one way of nurturing them is through these different assessments and doing it at the national level, for instance. And I think there are a number of countries which are contemplating doing that now, but I think we are all looking at how to do it and how should we go about doing it. And it's not necessarily an easy thing, because it needs to be anchored properly at the national level, and that differs quite a lot from one country to another. So it needs to be really scientifically credible, but at the same time it needs to have political legitimacy, it needs to be relevant to policymakers, and needs to reflect the latest science and the latest thinking there. So there's a number of things that need to be brought together, but that's also where I hope that IPBES, through capacity building, can help assist societies around the world in sort of going about advancing this thought process, this collective thought process of ours.
Em relação especificamente ao Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, o que foi traduzido para o português é o sumário executivo. Ele, a gente não tem a tradução de todos os volumes. E isso se deve em grande parte, na verdade, ao fato de que o compromisso das Nações Unidas é a produção de documentos nas 6 línguas oficiais das Nações Unidas. O espanhol é uma delas, o português não é uma delas, né? Então, cabe muito mais aos órgãos nacionais fazerem esse esforço quando há o interesse e a demanda. Então, eu não sei se a gente consegue, quer dizer, ter apoio para fazer uma tradução completa. Isso não tenho a menor dúvida que o Ministério do Meio Ambiente já tentou fazer, não conseguiu apoio, não conseguiu recursos para fazer, e eu não vejo nenhuma perspectiva de que no futuro próximo isso seja feito. O que nós estamos nos preocupando no IPBES, na produção de documentos, na divulgação, nas páginas dos portais, é justamente trazer para as línguas que são utilizadas pelos países. Nós não estamos considerando e não vamos considerar nos nossos assessments só aquilo que foi publicado em Journal Internacional, em inglês, como é, por exemplo, a base de IPCC. A gente quer as coisas publicadas em português, a gente quer as coisas publicadas em outras línguas que não são do sistema. Muitas coisas do conhecimento tradicionais, a gente tem outras linguagens ainda que são completamente distintas. Então, essa é uma preocupação que existe desde do início da montagem da plataforma, de como é que você atinge esse público de forma que se torne mais efetiva o resultado dos diagnósticos que vão ser elaborados. Eles têm uma diferença muito grande em relação ao Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, que é um trabalho fantástico, muito bem conduzido, mas quando ele ficou pronto, os governos ignoraram eles, porque não foi solicitado pelos governos, não houve um envolvimento, houve uma decisão de países de que aquilo deveria ser produzido. É uma das razões pelas quais se criou a Plataforma Intergovernamental. Então, nós estamos fazendo coisas que são demandadas e pedidas pelos governos, ou diretamente, por solicitações, ou através das convenções das quais esses governos fazem parte. Então, o resultado automaticamente tem que ser considerado e usado pelos governos que são membros do IPBES. Hoje são 119 países membros. Ser membro é uma decisão voluntária de cada país, mas implica que o país, ao se tornar membro, ele vai estar aceitando os diagnósticos que vão estar sendo realizados. Bom, eu gostaria então, thank you very much, Ivar, muito obrigado.